After 40 years on the bench, I thought I'd seen every shade of human conflict. Anger, regret, remorse, the whole spectrum of hurt. But that morning, before a single word was spoken, I felt a heaviness in the room. The sky outside was gray, the kind of gray that looks like it forgot sunlight exists, and the courthouse felt heavier for it. Still, it wasn't the weather that warned me. It was the way she walked in, chin high, conscience low, gliding like consequences of rumors she'd never heard. Cases like this, one always carried a different kind of weight. When privilege strolls in wearing perfume and entitlement, justice requires more patience than when danger walks in wearing handcuffs. Her name stared up at me from the docket, like a headline waiting to happen. Charlotte Newen, 22. Daughter of the Deputy Minister of Internal Affairs. Asterisk, asterisk. I never cared who someone's parents were. Power doesn't excuse behavior in my courtroom. But experience taught me that those raised inside walls built from influence often grow up believing the world should bend around them. The charge? Simple assault. Minor injury. Small words for something that can leave a bruise far deeper than the skin. She wasn't the only one in the room, though. On the opposite side stood Lynn Pham, the young cafe worker Charlotte had shoved and slapped. Lynn looked as if the floor might swallow her if she breathed wrong. Her hand shook not out of theatrics, but out of a lifetime spent apologizing for things that weren't her fault. I just told her the seat was reserved, she whispered. My manager said it was booked for a birthday. I said it politely. Her voice trembled like something fragile fighting to stay whole. And then I asked. She pushed me. Then she slapped me. Her hand rose instinctively to her cheek. The bruise nearly gone, but the memory still fresh. She didn't want Charlotte arrested. She didn't even call the police. A customer did. I just didn't want to lose my job, she said. That line hit harder than any slap ever could. When you've seen thousands of people stand before you, you learn to recognize the ones who break a little on the inside. Lynn wasn't asking for justice. She was asking not to fall deeper into struggle. Then the doors opened, and the temperature in the room seemed to shift. Charlotte walked in with sunglasses perched atop her head, designer coat draped over her arm, and a phone still glowing in her hand. She didn't look worried. She looked annoyed. "Can we make this quick?" she said. "I have Pilates in an hour." It wasn't what she said. It was how she looked at Lynn, as though Lynn were a wrinkle in her schedule, not a human being. I asked her if she understood why she was here. "Yes," she sighed. "Because this girl," she flicked her hand toward Lynn, "got offended over nothing. I barely touched her." Lynn flinched at that, not because of the word barely, but because the dismissal stung deeper than the slap. And then Charlotte said it, the phrase that always draws a boundary between arrogance and empathy. People like her are always dramatic. That did it. Not the slap, not the entitlement, but people like her. So I asked questions. I let silence do its work. I held up a mirror until her own words echoed loudly enough that even she couldn't ignore them. I looked at Lynn. She worked double shifts to afford her mother's medication. She feared losing a single wage because it meant losing stability. And when I asked why she hadn't taken the next day off after the incident, she said quietly, "I couldn't. If I lose hours, we fall behind." Her life depended on hours. Charlotte's life depended on conveniences. When I turned to Charlotte and asked what she thought would happen when she pushed Lynn, she said, "I thought she'd apologize and move." Because in her world, people moved out of her way. But privilege can't stand unchallenged forever. Little by little, I watched her armor crack, not in dramatic shards, but in small, undeniable fractures. Discomfort flickered behind her eyes. Reflection followed. Eventually, the question arrived. What now? A fine wouldn't teach her anything. Consequences that could be paid with pocket change wouldn't force her to confront anything. So I assigned 30 hours of community service at a senior care center, along with a handwritten apology and an empathy workshop. "That's manual work," she whispered, stunned. "Yes," I said. "Exactly." A week later, she returned, without sunglasses, without the friend who giggled in the gallery, without the shield of entitlement. She held out a draft of her apology letter. It was polished, neat, empty. "No," I told her. Real apologies aren't written with perfect grammar. They're written with truth. She looked lost. I don't know how to write that. That's why you need to. And something in her, something small but real, shifted. 6 weeks later, she walked back and looking like someone who had stepped into another world and come back changed. She completed the service hours and asked to keep volunteering. I met someone named Mrs. Yvonne, she said, a shy smile tugging at her voice. She thanks me every day for helping her stay steady. But I think she steadied me more. She handed me her final apology letter. The handwriting was messy, rushed, honest. Not a performance. A confession. She turned to Lynn and whispered, "I'm sorry. Truly." And Lynn, with the kind of strength that comes from surviving more than most people notice, said, "I forgive you." Not dramatically, just quietly, genuinely. That's the kind of ending that stays with a judge. My father used to tell me justice isn't a hammer. It's a lantern. You don't use it to break people. You use it to help them see. And that day, Charlotte saw herself. Not who her last name made her, who she could choose to become. As she left the courtroom, she paused. "Your Honor, thank you for not giving up on me." "I didn't do anything remarkable," I said. "I just held up a mirror." She nodded and closed the door gently behind her. Sometimes justice ends with a sentence. But sometimes, if you're lucky, it begins a change. And in a world where everyone is rushing past one another, kindness might be the one verdict we all have the power to deliver. Justice isn't a hammer. It's a lantern. This idea becomes clearer the longer you watch people walk into a courtroom carrying their stories on their shoulders. A hammer breaks, forces, and crushes. A lantern reveals. It lights the corners that people hide from, exposes truths they didn't dare face, and guides them toward a path they didn't even know existed. When you spent 4 decades listening to trembling voices, angry confessions, and quiet heartbreaks, you understand that justice is rarely about punishment. It is about understanding what led someone across a line and whether they can walk back from it with a different heart. Punishment ends a story. Illumination begins one. On the day Charlotte knew and walked into my courtroom, the weight of that principle felt sharper than usual. Anyone could have looked at her and seen a simple case, a privileged girl using entitlement like armor, dismissing the world around her with a flick of her perfectly manicured hand. But I saw something else too, something hidden behind the practiced indifference in her posture, a subtle tension, a flicker of uncertainty, the fragile possibility that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't beyond reach. People don't become entitled in isolation. They are shaped by the walls they grow inside. And sometimes, the right light at the right moment can make those walls transparent enough for them see beyond themselves. Lynn stood across from her like the quiet opposite of everything Charlotte represented. Soft-spoken, hard-working, holding her fear the way some people hold their breath underwater. She didn't want revenge, just dignity. And dignity is something the world often takes from people like her before they've even learned how to protect it. When she said she kept working after the incident because missing a shift meant falling behind on bills, that lantern inside me flickered brighter. Justice was needed here, yes, but not the kind measured in fines and signatures. This required a gentler, guiding light. When Charlotte dismissed Lynn's pain with the phrase, "people like her," the hammer within me stirred, as it always does when arrogance tries to masquerade as confidence. But the lantern inside me won. It always has to win. A judge who swings only the hammer creates fear, not growth. A judge who lifts a lantern creates change. So instead of condemning her with sharp words, I let silence do what hammers can't. Make her hear herself. Make her sit with the echo of her own cruelty. Make her uncomfortable, because discomfort is the first step toward awakening. By the time I ordered her to complete community service, it wasn't a punishment. It was a doorway, a chance for her to meet people whose lives had never cushioned them from consequence, a chance for her to discover that care, responsibility, and humility can shape a person more deeply than money or last names ever will. When she later told me about Mrs. Yvonne, the elderly woman she helped care for, her voice didn't carry entitlement anymore. It carried softness, confusion, growth, The kind of change that happens only when a lantern has been held long enough to warm someone who didn't know they were cold. The apology letter she eventually wrote was messy and imperfect, but perfectly real. It showed something no court order can force: reflection. And that is the moment justice truly happens. Not when a sentence is spoken, but when a heart shifts. A hammer could have punished her for a day. A lantern allowed her to change for a lifetime. This is why I say justice isn't a hammer. It's a lantern. Because when we shine light instead of striking blows, we don't just close cases. We open hearts. We guide people out of the shadows they didn't know they were standing in. And sometimes that light follows them long after they leave the courtroom, illuminating the kind of person they choose to become. Privilege is a strange kind of armor. It doesn't always come from money alone, nor from status, nor from the power of a last name. Sometimes it comes from growing up in a world where consequences are rare and apologies are optional. People raised in such spaces often learn early that doors open before they knock, that mistakes get smoothed over before they recognize them as mistakes, and that the discomfort of others is merely background noise. Accountability becomes a foreign language, one they've never needed to learn. But there comes a moment, inevitably, when life stops bending for them, and in that moment their true character is revealed. This was exactly what I witnessed the day Charlotte walked into my courtroom. She entered with the calm confidence of someone who believed the world ran on her schedule. The tilt of her chin, the measured sway of her steps, the slight impatience in her eyes, it all spoke of a life padded with advantages. And yet, I didn't see evil in her. I saw someone who had never been asked to look beyond her own reflection. Privilege, when unexamined, creates a blindness so subtle that the person living inside it doesn't even know they can't see. Charlotte's blindness wasn't unusual. In fact, I've seen it more times than I care to count. What made her case different was the person standing across from her. Lynn had none of the soft shields that had cushioned Charlotte all her life. She didn't have connections waiting to defend her, or a future line with opportunities she could take for granted. She had long shifts, minimum wages, bills stacked like quiet reminders of responsibility, and a mother whose medication depended on every hour she could manage to work. When she spoke, her voice was soft but steady, and everything about her presence reflected someone who had learned to hold herself together, because falling apart was never an option. Where Charlotte stood with entitlement, Lynn stood with endurance. And endurance, quiet as it is, carries a power privilege cannot replicate. The contrast between them wasn't just visible. It was almost audible, like the low hum of two different worlds meeting for the first time. Charlotte saw Lynn as an inconvenience, someone occupying a seat she believed belonged to her by default. Lynn saw Charlotte as a threat to her security, a customer whose displeasure could cost her the only financial stability she had. The same moment carried entirely different stakes for each of them. That is the real truth about privilege. Those who have it often experience life in soft focus, while those without it live with every edge sharpened. When Charlotte said, "People like her are always dramatic," something shifted in the room. It wasn't just an insult. It was the purest expression of how privilege can strip empathy from a person. In her world, people like Lynn, those who serve, clean, assist, carry out instructions, aren't meant to have feelings that matter. They are part of the scenery, part of the service, part of the expectation that life should move smoothly for people like her. Privilege had convinced Charlotte that she was the center and others existed around her. Accountability meant reminding her that every person has a center of their own. But accountability is not about humiliation. It is not about vengeance. It is not about proving power. True accountability is about making someone recognize the weight of their actions and the ripple they create in other people's lives. So when I looked at Charlotte, I didn't see a criminal. I saw a young woman standing at the crossroads of who she had been taught to be and who she might become. It was my responsibility to ensure she didn't leave the courtroom unchanged. The consequence I assigned her wasn't meant to punish her body, but to touch her conscience. Community service wasn't merely a task. It was a mirror. It forced her into proximity with people whose lives would never resemble hers. For the first time, she had to serve instead of being served. She had to listen instead of assuming. She had to help someone who needed her, not because she wanted praise, but because their well-being depended on her presence. And slowly, The edges of her entitlement began to soften. The moment she told me about Mrs. Yvonne, the elderly woman she assisted, I recognized something rare. She had finally seen someone outside her world as fully human, not as background, not as inconvenience, not as someone like her, but simply as a person with a story, with struggles, with value. Privilege had once blinded her to that truth. Accountability helped her see it. This is why the balance between privilege and accountability matters so deeply. Without accountability, privilege becomes cruelty. With accountability, privilege can transform into responsibility. And that transformation, once it begins, can change not only how a person behaves, but how they understand themselves. Charlotte came into the courtroom expecting the world to bend. She left understanding that sometimes the world stands firm and asks you to bend instead. Strength doesn't always appear in loudness or defiance. Sometimes it stands quietly, almost invisibly, in the posture of someone who has learned to survive without drawing too much attention. That is the kind of strength Lynn carried the day she stood in my courtroom. At first glance, you might think she looked fragile. Her hands neatly clasped, her shoulders slightly curved inward, her voice soft as though she feared it might break if it rose too high. But the more she spoke, the more it became clear that this wasn't fragility at all. It was resilience shaped by circumstances that had demanded endurance long before she ever met Charlotte. There is a unique kind of courage in the vulnerable, especially those who spend their days navigating systems that rarely offer them grace. Unlike the privileged, they do not have safety nets woven beneath their choices. Every decision they make is calculated. Every risk weighed against consequences that can topple their stability. When Lynn described the incident, how she politely told Charlotte the seat was reserved, how she tried to explain before being shoved and slapped, there was no bitterness in her tone, only a quiet sadness, the kind of sadness that belongs to people who are used to being dismissed. She did not want to be in court. She didn't even call the police. That detail spoke volumes. In her world, drawing attention, even when she was right, felt dangerous. She feared losing her job more than she feared injustice. That alone tells a heartbreaking truth about the lives of people like her. Survival often outweighs a desire for fairness. When she said she wanted to work the next day because she couldn't afford to miss a shift, it wasn't an excuse. It was a window into the life she lived. One where a single lost hour could become a week of worry. People like Lynn carry a strength many never notice. A strength built not on confidence but necessity. She wakes up every day knowing she has earned every inch of ground she stands on, while others glide across miles without realizing they are being carried. Yet she doesn't complain. She doesn't lash out. She keeps moving, even under the weight of exhaustion and fear. That kind of strength is quiet, but it is unbreakable. Watching her in the courtroom, I felt a familiar ache. One I felt many times when people with the least protection show the greatest grace. She wasn't asking for compensation. She wasn't demanding punishment. She just wanted acknowledgement. She wanted someone to say what happened to her mattered, that she mattered. And sometimes that is the bravest thing a vulnerable person can do, to stand in front of power and speak a truth that could be ignored, minimized, or doubted. Her voice trembled at times, yes, but trembling isn't weakness. It's proof that something is costing you energy, and you're doing it anyway. Lynn's entire presence was proof that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers while holding back tears. Sometimes it stands steady even when its knees shake. And sometimes it apologizes for taking up space, even when it's the one who has been wronged. Charlotte's behavior toward her wasn't just disrespect. It was a reflection of how the world often treats people who serve, clean, organize, and support the structures everyone else depends on. People like Lynn are expected to stay invisible, to smile even when mistreated, to accept what they're given without complaint. When Charlotte brushed her off with the phrase "people like her," wasn't just an insult. It was a reminder of how easily society reduces the vulnerable into categories rather than individuals. Yet in that courtroom, Lynn's quiet presence challenged that narrative. Not through anger, but through honesty. She showed that vulnerability and courage are not opposites. They coexist. She proved that strength doesn't always look like boldness. Sometimes it looks like showing up even when you want to disappear. It looks like telling the truth even when your voice shakes. It looks like facing someone who hurt you and choosing dignity instead of vengeance. I've watched countless people stand where she stood, but Lynn's story remained with me because it highlighted a truth we rarely acknowledge. The vulnerable often carry the most profound bravery. They face life without armor, without influence, without assurances, and still they move forward. That is courage in its purest form. Long after the case was over, it wasn't the slap or the entitlement I remembered. It was the way Lynn steadied herself before speaking, the way she chose honesty over anger, the way she held her ground despite having so little ground to stand on. People like her don't make headlines. They don't command attention. But their strength, once seen, lingers. And it reminds us that real courage isn't loud. It's persistent, steady, and quietly, undeniably powerful. Empathy often arrives in moments when we least expect it, slipping past the defenses we build around ourselves and settling quietly into the spaces we've left unexamined. Most people move through life with a version of themselves they think they already understand, but real change doesn't begin until that version collides with the truth of how they affect others. Charlotte's transformation didn't start with my questions, the courtroom, or even the consequences she would later face. It began with a single moment. The instant she heard her own words reflected back to her and recognized, perhaps for the first time, the harm in her tone, the dismissal in her attitude, and the pain she caused without even giving it a second thought. Before that moment, she moved through the world with ease, her actions softened by privilege and her mistakes absorbed by people who had always shielded her from discomfort. Accountability had never demanded anything more than a brief apology or a change of tone. So when she walked into the courtroom, she believed it would be another inconvenience quickly handled, a misunderstanding to be brushed aside. But empathy isn't born from convenience. It is born from discomfort, from being forced to confront a truth that doesn't flatter us. When Lynn spoke, her voice trembling yet determined, something subtle shifted in Charlotte's expression. It wasn't guilt, not yet. It was confusion, the beginning of realization. Because in that moment, she wasn't looking at a nameless cafe worker who had irritated her. She was looking at a human being recounting pain she had caused. That is a pivot point where empathy begins, when the other person stops being other and starts being someone whose feelings carry weight. It's easy to feel empathy for people we admire, respect, or love. But the true test of character is whether we can extend empathy to those we overlook. Charlotte had spent so long assuming that people in service roles existed only to make her life easier that she never stopped to consider their emotions, their struggles, their stories. Lynn's trembling voice cracked that illusion. For the first time, Charlotte was confronted not with a rule she had broken, but with a person she had hurt. That is why consequences must teach, not simply punish. Because punishment ends with compliance. But learning, true, heartfelt learning, ends with transformation. And transformation is the only kind of justice that continues long after the sentence has been served. Redemption is rarely a sudden explosion of realization. It is usually a slow awakening that begins with a single human connection strong enough to pierce through layers of ego, fear, pride, and defensiveness. When two lives collide from entirely different worlds, the meeting point often becomes a mirror, one that reflects the truth neither person had seen before. That is what happened when Charlotte stepped into the care center and met Mrs. Yvonne, a woman whose gentle presence and quiet wisdom carried more power than any courtroom sentence could. Charlotte arrived with resistance, still clinging to her like armor. She told herself she was there because she had no choice, because a judge had placed his condition upon her, because the world misunderstood her intentions. But beneath all those excuses lay a girl who'd been shielded by privilege for so long that she had never been required to step into someone else's shoes. She had apologized in court. She had cried. But even then, her transformation was incomplete. Real change doesn't begin with regret. It begins with understanding. And that understanding only awakens when someone is brave enough to let you into their world. Mrs. Yvonne didn't ask Charlotte about her mistake, her lifestyle, or her background. She didn't ask why she was there. Instead, she simply welcomed her with a warmth that Charlotte wasn't used to feeling from strangers. She guided her through simple tasks, organizing papers, setting up reading materials, assisting patients. Yet each task carried layers of meaning Charlotte didn't grasp at first. She noticed how gently Mrs. Yvonne spoke to every patient, how she remembered tiny details about their lives, how she never rushed even though her workload was heavy. Every interaction was slow, intentional, dignified. Charlotte, who had lived her life in a fast, reactive, self-centered rhythm, was forced to match a different pace, one rooted in care rather than convenience. Over time, she began observing how small gestures, steadying a tired hand, offering a glass of water, adjusting a blanket, could bring real comfort to someone. She saw how deeply people longed to be seen and acknowledged. She saw how meaningful it was to stand beside someone in their vulnerability. She began realizing that her own actions outside the care center had lacked that awareness, that respect, that softness. And slowly, the gap between her world and his began to shrink. She asked questions. She listened. She stayed longer than required. She stopped checking the time. It wasn't punishment anymore. It was purpose. Mrs. Yvonne, without lecturing her, embodied the kind of empathy Charlotte had never practiced. She became a quiet mentor, a reflection of the person Charlotte could become if she chose growth over pride. And for the first time, Charlotte understood that redemption wasn't something granted by a judge. It was something earned through honest connection and genuine change. She realized that the people she once judged or ignored had entire lives behind their eyes. Struggles, histories, dreams, disappointments. She felt a weight lift from her chest each time she allowed herself to feel instead of defend. She recognized that compassion wasn't a weakness, but a strength that could rebuild the fractured pieces inside her. By the time her service hours ended, Charlotte was not the same person who had walked into that center. The world hadn't changed. She had. Her apology, once forced by circumstance, had turned into something she truly meant. Her understanding of responsibility had deepened, not because she feared consequences, but because she had seen the human side of impact. And in that transformation, she discovered a version of herself she never knew existed. One capable of empathy, humility, and genuine care. Redemption didn't erase her mistake, but gave her the power to rise above it. And all of it began with one human connection. One woman who looked at her not with judgment, but with belief. Mrs. Yvonne never tried to fix her. She simply showed her what kindness looks like. And once Charlotte saw it, she could no longer return to the person she had been. I watched her wrestle with that awareness. At first, she tried to brush it off, insisting she barely touched Lynn. But denial is often the first stage of transformation. People resist the truth until it becomes too heavy to ignore. When silence stretched through the courtroom, when her own words echoed back in the air between us, the weight of her behavior finally began to settle onto her shoulders. Her posture shifted, her gaze lowered, not dramatically, not theatrically, but in tiny, telling movements. That is how empathy starts, not as a loud confession, but as a quiet unraveling. The true breakthrough came during her community service. Punishment can force compliance, but only empathy can produce change. When she began working at the senior care center, she entered a world with no advantage, no status, and no shortcuts. She had to lift, support, assist, listen. She had to be patient. She had to face people whose frailty demanded gentleness. People who relied on her not because she was important, but because she was simply there. And in that space, stripped of privilege, something inside her opened. Her connection with Mrs. Yvonne was a turning point. Here was a woman who depended on steady hands, kind words, and attentive presence. Caring for her required softness, responsibility, and genuine human connection. Charlotte couldn't fake that. And somewhere in the repetition of helping someone dress, guiding them to a chair, listening to their stories, and watching them struggle through simple tasks, she encountered a kind of vulnerability she had never allowed herself to witness before. In witnessing it, she discovered a new version of herself, one capable of gentleness, patience, compassion. The next time she entered my courtroom, she carried herself differently. Her apology letter was imperfect, her handwriting uneven, but the sincerity in her voice was unmistakable. She didn't read it like a formality. She read it like someone who had finally understood the way her actions. She looked at Lynn not with defensiveness or superiority, but with recognition of the pain she had caused and the humanity she had overlooked. Empathy is the moment you stop seeing yourself at the center of every story. And that is what Charlotte discovered. She walked into the courtroom believing she was the main character. She walked out understanding that everyone she encounters carries a world of their own, fragile, complex, deserving of respect. That transformation didn't erase what she had done, but it changed the person who had done it. And sometimes, that change is the most meaningful form of justice. Consequences are often misunderstood. People assume they exist to punish, to inflict discomfort, to make someone pay for what they've done. But the truth I've learned over decades is that punishment alone rarely changes a person. Real change comes from consequences that make someone think, reflect, and understand. Consequences that teach instead of simply hurt. A fine can empty a wallet, but it can't fill a conscience. Jail can restrain a body, but it doesn't always reach the mind. True accountability is not about severity. It's about meaning. And that meaning reveals itself only when a consequence connects directly with the lesson a person needs to learn. This truth guided me the day I assigned Charlotte her community service. Looking at her, I knew that a monetary penalty would accomplish nothing. Money had never been a barrier in her life. Spending it wouldn't leave a mark, much less create a lesson. She would have paid the fine, walked out of the courthouse, and folded the experience into the long list of inconveniences she believed the world had unfairly placed on her schedule. There would be no pause for reflection, no discomfort, no reason for her to consider how her entitlement had shaped the moment that brought her into that room. But consequences that teach are different from consequences that merely check a box. They reflect the harm done in a way that invites the person to feel, understand, and grow. When I looked at Lynn, quiet, shaken, and yet somehow composed, I knew the gap between her life and Charlotte's was a lesson waiting to be taught. Lynn wasn't privileged, protected, or insulated. She worked for every bit of stability she had, and she feared losing even one shift because survival in her world depended on every hour earned. Meanwhile, Charlotte had caused harm with the ease of someone who assumed the world existed to accommodate her moods. So the question wasn't how to punish her. It was how to make her see, how to make her understand what she never had to face before, how to pull her out of the insulated narrative she had grown up inside and place her gently, but firmly, into the reality of someone whose life required empathy, patience, and responsibility. Community service at a senior care center wasn't chosen at random. It was chosen because it demanded precisely the qualities she lacked: attentiveness, humility, and sustained human connection. When people are forced into environments where their old habits don't work, something cracks open inside them. Familiar patterns fail. Automatic reactions fall apart. And in that vulnerable space where nothing feels easy, a lesson is able to take root. That is what I hoped would happen with her. Not humiliation. Transformation. The reports I received from the care center confirmed what I had sensed. She struggled at first. She was uncomfortable, impatient, uncertain of what to do. For someone used to being served, learning to serve was like learning to walk on new legs. But discomfort is not the enemy. It is the gateway. Over time, her hands learned gentleness. Her voice softened. Her posture changed when helping someone frail take a few careful steps. She began asking questions instead of giving instructions. She began listening. Then came her bond with Mrs. Yvonne, the elderly woman whose presence unexpectedly pierced through Charlotte's shell. It's remarkable how often transformation comes from the people we least expect. By helping someone who couldn't move without her support, Charlotte started seeing beyond herself. She began to notice details she had once ignored. The trembling of someone's hand, the effort it took for them to sit upright, the fear in their eyes when they lost balance. These weren't tasks. They were moments of connection. They forced her to confront the reality of someone else's vulnerability, and through that, she finally recognized her own humanity. When she stood in front of me again, something had undeniably shifted. She wasn't performing remorse. She was living it, not because she feared further consequence, but because the consequence she had been given had already reached her, worked through her, and changed her understanding of herself. That's the power of a teaching consequence. It outlives the duration of the punishment. What mattered to me wasn't the hours she completed, but the perspective she carried back with her. She saw the world differently. She saw people differently. And most importantly, she saw herself differently. A fine would have taken money. Community service returned her humanity.